All right, so hello. We are going to be working on um, looking at who the contributors were for the theory of evolution, and specifically we are going to look at Hutton and Lyle, as well as Lamarck, Darwin, and Devine. We'll be doing slides 27 through 44 today, and then next week we'll have slides 45 through I think about 58. Today's slides also contain I believe only one 3-minute-ish video that we're going to watch as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and start looking at Hutton and Lyle. And both of them realized that the Earth was millions of years old, not the thousands of years old. That was the predominant theory at the time. Remember, both of these guys are in the 1700s to 1800s. This is so Hutton died in 1797 and Lyle died in 1875. So the predominant theory at the time was definitely creationism, and that God created everything and it was maybe 4,000 years old. Both of them looked around and realized that probably not the case. And there's an interesting clip we're going to watch on James Hudson here in a moment. Both of them looked at the things that were the formations on Earth and said those processes that changed Earth in the past weren't just something that happened in the past, that they were actually still happening today, and that they can also be used to explain how things can be built up or eroded away over millions of years. So, 3-minute video on James Hudson real quick.
When you look at a rock, what do you see? Well, you probably see what I see. A rock. Gray, brown, maybe a few sparkles. Nothing too exciting. But to 18th century geologist James Hutton, rocks were more than just rocks. Instead, they were the keys to Earth's history. Billions of years of stone shifting, melting, crunching, twisting, and reforming. A history that he discovered in a time when most people believe 1,000 years old. Hutton was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, June 1, 1926. A floater studying at several universities throughout his youth. This wasn't a big deal. He had a pretty large inheritance and several farms and was able to live comfortably without finding a specific trade. According to his teachers, he didn't like math very much, but he did have a strong interest in chemistry. He qualified as a doctor and wrote his medical dissertation on the circulation of blood, which he believed correctly, but for the wrong reasons, was being constantly destroyed and renewed. Eventually, Hutton decided that he didn't really want to pursue medicine. He spent some time on his farms, and then he moved back to Edinburgh in 1768 and began to develop his ideas about geology, which also involved renewal and recirculation. In Hutton's time, a lot of people believed that Earth was shaped by catastrophes, like the ones in the Bible. But Hutton thought that Earth actually went through a constant cycle of destruction and renewal. He proposed that rocks and soil are eroded and swept into the sea, and then compacted into bedrock before being twisted and turned by enormous pressure. A few years after he first came up with this theory, Hutton discovered evidence for it in a few different rock formations. The most famous of these discoveries was at Sicker Point, a cliff off the eastern coast of Scotland that features layers of red sandstone and greywacke, a darker type of sandstone. The layers were sitting on top of each other, but they were also running in layers perpendicular to one another in what we now call an angular unconformity. He hypothesized that only great amounts of time and great pressure could have offset the rocks, much longer than 6,000 years. And as we now know, of course, he was right. This feature at Sicker Point and several others around Scotland are called Hutton's Unconformity in his honor. He also discovered that granite was an igneous rock formed by the cooling of molten lava, by observing tendrils of granite that had made their way into rock like sandstone, which he realized could only have happened at very high temperatures. Hutton believed that this was strong evidence that there was molten rock below the surface of the Earth, and that this molten rock was constantly pushing outward and then melting again. He published his findings in a paper in 1788, but his theories didn't always gain traction because they often contradicted the idea that the Earth was 6,000 years old. Plus, a lot of other scientists' geological theories incorporated the Great Flood described in the Bible. Hutton's ideas did not. But a lot of his work turned out to be accurate, even though he didn't have access to technologies like carbon dating, which would have put actual numbers on the ages of rocks. Hutton also paved the way for future scientists like 19th century British geologist Charles Lyell to develop a theory called uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism is the idea that the processes that shape the world now also shaped it in the past. So scientists can work backward and figure out what happened in the past. By assuming that natural laws function in the same way across space and time, we don't need major catastrophes to explain how Earth formed. Instead, we can show that it's the result of slow processes over enormous spans of time. Thanks to Hutton, the picture of our world got a lot more complex. He was wrong about some stuff, but many of his ideas helped shape geological concepts that we still use today. Not too bad for a guy who's famous for saying that the Lord should pity the backside that is, and I quote, clagged to a head that will hunt stones. Thanks for watching this episode of SciShow, which was brought to you by our patrons on Patreon. If you want to help support the show, you can go to Patreon.
Okay, sorry about the barking dogs. I will also include the link for this in case we need that, in case you want to hear the beginning part where they were barking. All right, so interesting about Hutton and Lyle, and they did not actually make their findings at the same time. Lyle did come after Hutton. That's kind of an important thing, even though we often see them grouped together in texts as if they were collaborators. Lamarck, love Lamarck. He hypothesized that traits that were acquired in one generation could be passed down to the next generation. And you acquired traits by doing something, the actions of the organism. So, for his very famous example, he said that the long necks of giraffes was acquired because giraffes needed to stretch their necks to reach their food, and that longer neck was then passed down to the kids, the offspring. Look at when Lamarck was alive. It was 1744 to 1829. So this is definitely a long time ago, before we had any knowledge of genetics. So this is a very famous picture. Originally, the giraffes had short necks, but they had to keep stretching in order to get to their food. So that resulted in them having these really long necks. It's kind of crazy because we know that if we do the same thing over and over again, we're not going to pass that particular trait down. So if you kick a soccer ball over and over and over again, your calf muscles are going to be bigger. Your offspring are not going to have bigger calves just because you have bigger calves, unless they do the same exact thing and they build up the muscle. But if then their offspring does not do soccer, they would not have the larger calves. So just a thought that, it would not be logical in our minds today that this could work. I could see how somebody in the 1700s might think this, but we now know that that is not the case. It's a very famous theory, though. And now we get to Charles Darwin, who was born in 1809, died in 1882. Obviously, everybody knows Darwin. He's very famous for the theory of natural selection, which is that stated that organisms that are best suited to their environment survive and reproduced, kind of coined the term survival of the fittest, and that is based on an organism's phenotype. Remember, phenotype versus genotype. Phenotype is the physical traits that are being expressed versus genotype, which is the alleles. And De Vries, he claimed that new species arose from mutations. So this one, notice this picture's from the 1920. So he's definitely got some benefit in that he knows probably about Mendel at this point, and has an idea of chromosomes or alleles or something, enough that he can make this claim that they are from mutations. His theory was called the mutation theory of evolution, which actually, when you start thinking about it, probably isn't too far off. A lot of mistakes or mutations result in different phenotypes that may make an organism better suited to their environment. So I think De Vries was definitely headed in the right direction with his. All right, let's focus on the theory of natural selection, and this is the result of an interaction of genes and the environment during development. Sometimes this will cause variations in the phenotype. Remember, phenotypes can be physical and behavioral characteristics. So it's not just the color of something. Maybe it's a mating ritual or something like that that changes, or feeding patterns or things like that. So it can be behavioral. So only phenotypes that benefit the organism the most will survive long enough to reproduce. That's what it means to be having the survival of the fittest. And you have to be able to pass your genes on to the next generation. It allows traits to be more common in a population's gene pool. So specific genotypes will be selected for and others will be selected against. So if you're a white hare in the Arctic and your offspring is black-haired, black-furred, I don't know, do hares have fur or hair? I'm not sure. then they're going to be selected against. They'll be easier to spot in that snowy Arctic condition. Or you can look at the brown bears and the polar bears in the Arctic. Brown bears were selected against. If you had brown fur, you were more likely to die off. Remember what a genotype is? Just a quick reminder, it's a complete set of genes that an individual has. Okay, so Darwin based his theory on 4 main aspects. The first is overproduction, and that is that more offspring will be produced than can survive. You want to have as many offspring as you can so that the genes will be more than likely able to be passed on, and some of them will at least some of them will be able to reproduce themselves. Next, it's based on variation, which is that individuals have different phenotypes and genotypes. That means there's options. If the environment changes for whatever reason, different variations, different phenotypes and genotypes will then survive. If it stays the same, then you have a narrowing of that, and the ones that don't do as well won't survive to reproduce. Darwin's next main aspect was selection, and this is the results from competition for limited resources. So you will have organisms within the same species that will have to compete for food, water, shelter, and mates. Sometimes this will lead to a variation or a divergence to where a new species will arise that will maybe require different or seek different foods or different shelters or different mates, and that will reduce competition. But all of that competition is huge. It forces that evolution to happen. And then lastly, we have adaptation, which is inheritance. So your variations, both favorable and unfavorable, will get passed on to the offspring. The proportion of those with favorable phenotypes will be higher. So if you have the brown bear and the polar bear, and both are getting passed down, the percentage of offspring white polar bears will be much higher than the brown bears, right? Because the brown bear ones don't survive often to adulthood to reproduce and produce more brown bears because it's not favorable for those conditions. If the Arctic were to change and not be white anymore, those brown bear genes would definitely survive longer and be able to reproduce more. And I think you'll see a mixing until then eventually it will overcome and all the brown bears will be the predominant one and there will be very few white ones left. All right, so this is a visual of this. You have overproduction. Every species tends to produce more individuals than can survive to maturity. Okay, and then we have variation, those individuals of a population that have many characteristics that differ, different colors, different habits, different everything. Well, not everything, they're not that different, but different enough. Selection, so let's say the environment changes here, the darker ones are the ones that are surviving, the light ones are not here. And then eventually, as that condition seems to be the most favorable, you will have the predominant color change. So we go from being pretty evenly mixed to now most are dark brown and light browns are rarer. All right, so using the information presented, please write an explanation for how the genetic makeup of a population can change over time. You're going to do this right into your packet, okay? Which I forgot to tell you to pull out at the beginning. I'm hoping you guys know that by now. All right, so pause here, make sure you do that. And I think this will probably wind up being an opener next week. So make sure you've got it, because you can also use your notes for openers. Next, adaptations. Adaptation is when an organism becomes better suited to its environment, making it possible to better exploit its niche. So that means sometimes body structure or function will adapt. Sometimes it'll be physiological, and sometimes you will have behavioral adaptations. Sometimes you'll have all of them, sometimes you'll just have one. It just depends on what the changing environment calls for. Adaptive features promote fitness. So fitness is a measure of an organism's reproductive success, how well that organism can reproduce, survive long enough to reproduce. So we have here, we have a hummingbird that has a structural adaptation of a really long beak that is designed to only fit in specific flowers, and that way, if you can see how long this thing goes, and this is how long it has to go down. So it's very specific, a very specific adaptation. No other birds can really get to the nectar that this hummingbird can. the North American beaver has also adapted to exploit both a terrestrial, meaning land, and aquatic, meaning water, environment. All right, so let's look at these adaptations here. We have different beaks for, these are the finches, Darwin's finches, I believe, if I remember correctly. I think they're Darwin's finches. They all have different beaks because they eat different foods. Some are land dwelling, some are some are ground dwelling, some live in trees. It just depends on which island of the Galapagos that you go to for what kind of finch there is. Some eat fruit, some eat insects, some eat nuts. So they have different beaks that are better suited for the different foods. Here we have our white polar bear in the Arctic, blends in much better than if that was a brown bear. Your leaf, oh gosh, I forgot what those things are called. Not a praying mantis, but I forget what these are called. Leaf something, blends in, the structure looks like the veins of a leaf. It's pretty remarkable, the mimicry that is going on here. And then the peacock has these eye spots that are meant to intimidate and scare off predators. So this one's pretty cool. I just saw a show over the weekend on Netflix on The Color of Life, and they showed a peacock doing a dance. It was pretty incredible, and he has 6-foot-long feathers and over 100 or 1,000, I think it was 100 eye spots. It was pretty remarkable. And the adaptations of the North American beaver, and I'm going to slide over to the link in here. So using the Beaver Adaptations handout, which you guys are not going to have, you're just going to have the link, and I'm going to put it up on the screen in a second. Review the various ways the beaver has adapted. How have these adaptations allowed the beaver to exploit both aquatic and terrestrial environments? And how have the adaptations increased the beaver's fitness? So let's look at slide 41 down here. And you're going to write this right here. There's lots of room for you. And I think I actually put the link in the notes packet as well. But here is the stuff. So you can pause it here and look at the advantages to each of these things. Make sure you go in and answer both questions. Okay. Go ahead and pause that there if you need to. And let's go on. Adaptation and the environment. Convergent evolution. Organisms that are not related to each other develop similar traits. This is a result from adapting to similar environments or niches. So we have dolphins and sharks. Both of them have fins. Both of them live in the water. Both of them have no legs. They have a similar structure, but they can swim and survive in the same environment and have a similar appearance is relative. But there are two unrelated species that have developed similar techniques. They swim in the water. They have some similar, I think, just in general, similar structure, similar habitat. Okay. All right. Analogous structures. So these are structures that have the same function in unrelated taxa. They are not the result of shared ancestry. So each of these is a separate one. The leg of an ant is similar structure to the leg of a horse. Obviously, they are not related organisms. They just have the same function. So the leg of an ant does the same thing that the leg of a horse does. It helps the organism move on. The dolphin flipper is the same function as the fin of a fish. Same thing with bird wings, and insect wings. Both are wings, both help them fly. They have very different structures. Okay. Same with bat wings and butterfly wings. They're both wings, they help organisms fly, but they have very different structures. These guys, bat wings have bones in theirs. These are scales and they're very delicate. These are much sturdier. And that is relative. Okay. Last slide for today, speciation. This word's going to be key to understanding what we're talking about. Speciation is the formation of new and distinct species. So when we were looking at our cladograms in mission 1 and 2, every time there was a divergence, the different arm or the different branch broke off. That was speciation occurring. There was a specific trait that was different between the two. The one that kept going on the same arm had that trait. The one that broke off didn't. Typically, that's how it was. Or you could have done it vice versa. It doesn't. I guess it really doesn't matter how you did it. And then you have, when you have that speciation event, then a new species is arising. And the distinguishing feature of a species is that it's a group of organisms that are capable of interbreeding to produce fertile, meaning offspring that can reproduce themselves, offspring. And the way that this happens is that there is reproductive isolation. You have to have an organ or a species that is all by itself, not able to interbreed with the original species anymore. So that's called reproductive isolation, and we will talk about that in our next set of notes. So let's look at an example here. If you cross a horse and a donkey, the result is a sterile mule. So is a mule a distinct species? Why or why not? So go ahead and put that on your notes. We will talk about this. I think I'll make this one an opener question too, because I like having this example. It's a really good example. Okay, so take a minute, write that down, and then that's it for our notes for today. I will see you guys in next week's notes where we do finish up this unit's notes. Okay, if you have any questions, please bring them to class. Thank you.